Chapter 22, A Wanton Reality. A week after the funeral, Jody's lack of sleep had her staring out at the backyard as the sun peeked its light over the roof of the house. A fresh snow covered the ground, its white iciness smooth and shiny as pulled taffy. Standing with an old gray shawl wrapped around her shoulders like a withered fairy tale character, she stared at the playset, the instrument of destruction that had killed her baby. It was blanketed in the purity of snow, trying to convince her of its innocence. But it was a contradiction. It wasn't innocent, not by a long shot, she mused. It killed and caused pain and laughed at her by the clanging of the chains from the swings and the slide that resembled a tongue that mocked her. She could hear it, she could feel it. The longer she stood there, the more it taunted her, its mirth making her angry. She started to shake, feeling the anger begin at her feet and working its way up her spine. She had to stop it, she decided. Stop it from enacting any more harm on anyone in her family. She threw off the shawl, walked into the garage and grabbed Doug's hammer and stomped back through the kitchen to the back door, pulling the door open with enough force to hit the far wall with a thud. The snow snuck its way into her bedroom slippers as she marched to the playset. Raising the hammer over her head, she brought it down with a blinding crash on one of the support beams, again and again until Doug stopped her and yanked the hammer from her hand. Without a word, he simply looked at her with a shake of his head, turned and went back inside the house, leaving her as stranded as her emotions. After that, the days fused together in one into the other until they stretched into a darkened tunnel of melancholia. Weeks dragged into an endless journey of sorrow and unbearable pain that stabbed like a constant jab of needles from the inside out. Christmas had come and gone with little fanfare. No one expected the holiday to happen, but her father demanded the family celebrate all together with dinner and prayers, no exceptions. It's Christmas after all, and we must show our respect to the Lord, he insisted. During grace, Jody had bent her head in customary fashion, but instead of praying, she cursed God under her breath for his cruelty. The following day, she woke with such a pounding headache she knew it was her punishment for disrespecting God on his most holy of days. She lay in bed and asked for forgiveness until the headache made her fall asleep. The turning over of the new year was Doug's way of expecting life to return to the routine of daily life, as if the time for grieving had been allocated to 2 months. The sympathy he had shown up to that day and pain he endured was dismissed along with the passing of the year. He stated one night as gently as he could, "He's gone, Jody, and we need to move on. You have three other children who need your attention. We'll always grieve, but thinking about him is just continuing the pain. I can't endure thinking about him or it's going to kill me. I feel it's time to move forward and we try and get back into a normal routine for all our sakes." The words may have been said gently, but Jody heard hateful bitterness and blame and the unrealistic demand that she forget her son. She heard his options with ruthless finality to either abide by his wishes or catch his wrath. Even with the shock of Doug's dictate stabbing her heart, she knew she had had no other options but to obey him. If she disobeyed her husband, she would be breaking a vow and would garner God's wrath. He might punish her by taking another one of her children, she feared irrationally. She would obey if by no other means than pretend life was normal. As the days flowed endlessly on, she tried to reconcile her guilt with her grief and pretend things were normal, like the rest of her family had seemed to do. She watched and wondered in perplexed turmoil as her family moved forward with inexplicable continuity, the way someone might accept the passing of a beloved pet. In her grief-induced state, this is what she heard, and it became a resentful reality. In order to hide the disappointment she felt toward her daughter's callous attitudes and her disgust with Doug's nonchalance, she tried desperately to disguise her feelings under a cover of normalcy. She had been warned by her father that crying was unacceptable, that God had his reasons for taking her son, and crying was not showing true belief in his will. Her mother acquiesced with her father, and her sisters were uncomfortably absent. She was expected by everyone to go on with life like nothing was wrong. to not talk to Dougie J as she was prone to do, to not show grief, to not remind anyone of their loss. The weeks passed one into the other, endlessly, monotonously, the weight of the pretense getting heavier with each concealed emotion. Sometimes, while trying to maintain the daily routine that Doug expected, the weight bore down on her with aching cruelty, and her mind would slip into the past. Her day-long facade became so palpable at times she'd forget Dougie J was gone and call his name during the chaos of getting the kids ready for school, or seeing to the individual needs and wants, or just saying goodnight to them. Her memory was constantly taxed under the burden. February, she woke from a fitful sleep and disturbing dreams to a sense of bewilderment. She lay in bed trying to gather her thoughts while a feeling she was forgetting something important hummed along her nerves. Was it a dream? Did the kids need a gift for school or something? Had she forgotten something Doug wanted her to do? Without the luxury of gathering her thoughts, she was forced out of bed by the shouts of Lexi and Dayla arguing, Doug up and demanding a clean shirt, and Audra standing at the kitchen counter separating her mother's daily dose of medicines while doling out instructions to her. The doctors had loaded her with so much medication she stayed numb most of the time. The urge to remember what she'd forgotten went around and around in her head until she was dizzy. Knowing she was expected to stay on task with morning routines, she set aside the frustration of her faulty memory until the house was quiet and she could concentrate more fully. She instead started addressing the problems at hand. Dayla, Lexi, please stop shouting. I can't hear myself think. But our class is rehearsing for a Valentine concert next week, and the teacher wants us to come dressed like we're going to for the actual concert. I don't have a red sweater, and I asked Lexi if I can wear hers, and she got all stingy and said no. It's my sweater, and I'm wearing it this weekend. I don't want you to get it dirty. Mom, tell her to let me wear it. Dayla's whining was like nails on a chalkboard. Audra ignored the melee to inform her mother. Mother, listen, you have to take the blue ones at noon. Can you remember that? Doug's deep, demanding voice added to the pounding of the chaos. Jody, where's my blue shirt and matching tie? I'm going to be late for work. Mom, are you listening? You have to keep on schedule. The doctor said to make sure and not miss a single day. Yes, Audra, I hear you. Dayla, find something else to wear. You have a nice pink blouse. Wear that. Doug, the shirt is in the laundry room. I just ironed it and haven't put it away yet. I'll get it for you in just a sec. Girls, hurry up. You're going to be late for school. Lexi, don't you dare take that sandwich out of your bag. You're going to eat more than an apple for lunch. Do you hear me? Jody moved from counter to table to laundry room, from kid to kid, handing out pieces of toast, homework, and lunch sacks. Her feet and hands hurried in their movements. Frustration of her unsettled memory bore a hole in the back of her head, hard enough she was sure she could feel her nerve endings spasm. Dayla made one last attempt to get her way. You never take my side. She slammed the pantry door with her final word. The noise of the sharp snap of wood on wood from Dayla slamming the cabinet door was enough to snap the cord that had been holding Jody's false attempt at normalcy intact. As if she'd just remembered what was missing, she stated suddenly, like she would on any morning before the accident, "Oh, for Pete's sake, where is that boy?" She walked to the entrance of the kitchen and shouted down the hall, "Dougie J, honey, get out of bed and come and eat your breakfast." Like a loud boom of thunder, everyone jerked to a stop and fell silent, the electric current palpable from raw emotions. Jody turned to see everyone staring at her in stunned dismay, the tension a tangible entity, wondering why they had all stopped and gone quiet. She looked at each one of them in turn as their looks brought back to her what she'd done. Dougie J wouldn't be coming to breakfast, she remembered painfully. Not like he had died the day before. Her heart seemed to stop beating, and she grabbed the doorframe to keep herself upright. For one sweet moment in time, she had forgotten and life had been normal. Dougie J is dead. Dougie J is gone. He's gone. He's gone. Her temples began to throb from the continuous litany. Her knees locked in place to support her from crumbling to the floor. The silence in the room bit like January cold, unrelenting and inescapable. Doug looked at each of his daughters in turn and saw confusion in Lexi's eyes. Tears began to form in Audra's and shame in Dayla's. Like a disciplinarian who'd had enough, he finally broke the silence with an angry outburst. "Damn it, Jody! We've talked about this. What is it going to take to make you stop torturing us by calling Dougie J's name?" The words were spewed with needless venom. I forgot," Jody explained in stunning apology. "I don't know what else to do, Jody. I really don't. I feel like you enjoy reminding me he's gone. You have to stop this. It isn't helping anyone. I swear to God, if you don't stop, I don't know what I'm going to do." I'm sorry," she pleaded. "Well, I don't have time to deal with this now," Doug answered, looking at his watch. "Oh, great. Now I'm late for work. In the meantime, Jody, I want you to take your medication. Pray, read, do whatever you need to do to pull yourself together today. We'll talk about this tonight when I get home." Doug turned to his daughters and instructed, "Girls, gather your things and get to school. Your mother needs some time alone." Doug's dismissal of her feelings pushed the proverbial knife of resentment deeper into her wounds and brought back crippling reality. She looked to each of her daughters as they stared at her with expressions so full of hurt. She looked down to make sure she wasn't actually bleeding. Deciding the matter was closed, Doug walked furiously out of the house as he tied the tie around his neck like he were angry at his own throat. "I'll grab something at the office." She had been grateful in the last couple of months with Doug's atypical kindness and patience with her. But it seemed that time was over and he was gradually returning to the hardened personality she was used to. His anger at her slip was proof. Jody stood rooted to the floor, a withering weed, as Lexi and Dela, forgetting their squabble, quickly raced past her, grabbed their backpacks, and ran out the front door. In unison, they shouted their goodbyes without ever looking back. Audra, left alone with her mother in the kitchen, dropped the last of her mother's medication into the pill case and quickly followed her sisters out of the house, forgetting her coat on the living room chair in her haste to leave. "Mother, take your pills. Gotta go." Jody watched her family's anxious need to escape her presence and shuddered in unexpected horror. She'd forgotten again. She'd forgotten her son was gone, and for a few moments she had been happy. Life had been like it was before he'd been taken away. She cursed God under her breath and then felt guilty for her sin. She stood inside the doorframe, numb, broken, hollow. The silence of the house reverberated against her skull, and her mind shut down tight like a locked freezer, a black chasm of emptiness. She didn't know how long she stood still, but when she finally moved, her knees ached from being frozen in place. Unsure what to do, she let need take control and followed it into Dougie J's room. She carefully pushed the door open where it had remained closed since his death. Walking to the middle of the tiny room, she turned in full circles as if searching for him. The minutes passed as her thoughts tumbled over one another, not unlike dried tumbleweeds scraping her consciousness raw. Her skin tingled with the sensitivity. "They want me to forget him," she convinced herself. "They all want to pretend he never existed. They all want to take him away from me. Doug blames me." The grief-stricken thoughts fought for supremacy as they battled to be at the forefront of her mind. What if they wish I wasn't here too? They were in such a hurry to leave. What if they wish I didn't exist anymore because I caused them pain? This thought brought stifling fear. She struggled with the thoughts as they spun in her head. "I can't forget," she cried out loud, "but I can't remember either, or I'll lose my girls. They're afraid of me. I saw it in their eyes. I'll change. Please, God, I'll change," she prayed outwardly, pleading at the ceiling. "Please don't take my girls away too." With unparalleled courage, she made a silent vow to herself she would have to bear the pain of Dougie's death in solitude. She would have to choke on the rock of tears she'd been forced to swallow and closet her emotions, or the loneliness of missing him would be carried over into the non-existence of all her children. The earnestness of the thought made her eyelids begin to flutter, until after a few moments she was blinking so rapidly that objects in the room turned into a quick-moving flip pages. The pressure from the minutes of blinking made her head pound. Needing an aspirin, she walked back to the kitchen, slowly as to not bump into the walls. Reaching for the cabinet above the sink, she lowered her head to ease the pain when she saw the medication Audra had separated. She looked at them with hatred. The pills. It's the pills that's making me forget. She gathered them up in anger and squeezed her hand tight, choking them from existence. Never again, she swore. With the pills squished in her hand, she searched for a place to hide them where no one would ever find them. Flushing them down the sink never even occurred to her. With single-minded purpose, she walked back into Dougie J's room and stood still, trying to think. She scanned the room like a spy would scan a room on the place to hide a bugging device. A flash of yellow on the floor caught her attention, like it had been tugging on her pant leg. Peeking around the entrance of the closet, she could just make out the front end of a toy truck. She bent down and picked up Dougie J's favorite dump truck. A dump truck. How apropos, she mused. She took the pills, which were beginning to dissolve in her hand, and deposited them in the bucket of the toy. She then gave it a little shove and let it roll to the back corner of the closet, and set his snow boots in front of it. No more would they be able to make her take those horrible pills that made her forget. The antidepressants worked themselves out of her system with irritating slowness. But with each passing day, she could feel herself getting closer and closer to her son. She began to feel invigorated by the jumble of her thoughts because there was no clear focus in one direction to allow for forgetfulness. She was convinced it made her feel alert and more in tune with the world than she'd ever been in her life. So when everyone left for the day, she'd go to Dougie J's room and stay for most of the day, coming out just in time to carry on the non-existence of his death. Paranoia was a feeling she wasn't familiar with, but refused to admit it was taking hold. She remembered a poster from her high school days. "It's not that you're paranoid, they really are out to get you," and she took this saying as truth. "No one understands me but you, Dougie J," she said one day to the room at large after a very trying morning, hoping to fill the emptiness that was quickly becoming a part of her. By week 3, she could tell the pills had completely worked through her system. Her emptiness began to consume her like God had taken a big scoop and hollowed out her heart, leaving her with just the outer shell of her humanity. In the natural progression of endless routine, the habit of her new reality had her mind slipping between the torn pages of necessity and need. Each morning she would wait with forced patience for everyone to leave so she could retreat into Dougie J's bedroom, hide her daily dose of pills so Audra, who monitored them each night like Nurse Ratched, wouldn't find them, then spend the rest of the day close to her son. Before the end of the day, she would inspect the room for any imperfections. She'd go over every corner, obsessing over every speck of dust or wrinkle in his bed, wrinkles she herself made when she'd forget and sit down on it. Her own carelessness would then have her frantically trying to smooth out the imprint, rubbing the coverlet over and over until tears would form from frustration. Weeks after Doug's dictate, she escaped into Dougie J's room for her daily habit of correcting the flaws of life that seemed to reappear each night as if by magic. The feeling that came over her was not one of satisfaction this day, though, but one of trepidation. She stood in the middle of his bedroom, immobile in her modified reality, trying to identify the cause of her uneasiness. From the corner of her eye, she caught a movement. Looking up, she saw an image in the mirror above his tiny dresser. She saw her reflection. No, she saw a reflection. It felt strange because the person looking back at her copied her every move. And her eyes. She had pretty eyes, she thought, but empty. Eyes green as mold, but with an endless darkness in the pupils like a bottomless well. She didn't recognize the person, and it began to frighten her as the woman constantly stared back at her. Jody bravely looked into the face of this stranger, feeling she should know this woman, yet not recognizing the structure or the shape. She watched the eyes blink and blink until it maddened her, agitated that it was so familiar a face, yet so far away in a tentative realm. Temporarily forgetting the tidiness of the bed, she sat down on the edge, slowly, like the bones in her legs had melted away. She stared at the eyes in the mirror. The empty emotion of the stranger scared her, and she wanted to slip out of sight from this person who would not take her eyes from hers. She slid down the front of the bed in an almost imperceptible move and let her body sink to the floor, hoping if she did it slowly, this unnamed person wouldn't notice she was suddenly out of sight. When her butt hit the floor, her body decided to continue the journey until she was lying flat on the floor, secretly hoping it would open up and absorb her in. In self-preservation, she turned to her side and curled into a fetal position, hoping the mirrored person would get bored and eventually leave. She stared straight ahead of her into the darkness under the bed and into the lonely existence of her suffering. The loneliness was stifling, trapped inside her chest with a pressure so intense it made her nauseous. Was it minutes or hours later? She didn't know, but the shadow shaped looking back at her from under the bed gradually caught her attention. She unfolded herself and tilted her head in a way to solve a complicated problem. She reached under the bed and grasped the figure. The shape was familiar and comforting. Pulling it out and opening her hand, she recognized Dougie J's Peter Pan doll. Squeezing the tiny doll in both hands, she held it to her breast like a starving person holds a piece of bread while giving thanks. It was a link to her child. Her mind slipped a little further into a make-believe world of rightfulness. Where was Tinker Bell, she wondered. Did you leave Tinker Bell outside by herself again, Peter? She spoke to the doll, expecting an answer. When none was offered, she got up and said to the world at large, "Well, we must go find her then, mustn't we?" In the backyard, she kneeled in the icy crust of frozen ground while the sharp ridges of winter dug into her knees. Her hands became scratched and bloody from rooting through dormant growth. She knew somewhere in the back of her mind she should go inside and get a pair of gloves. But finding the tiny fairy took priority over her own comfort, so she simply ignored the nagging pains. She dug amongst the dead brown twigs and hummed to herself while keeping an eye on the Peter Pan doll she propped up against a tree. The earth had the comforting smell of old dirt and stale sunshine and made her wish she could dig a hole to bury herself in its warmth. Sorry, just checking. "Tinker Bell, where are you?" she asked in a sing-song fashion. She knew the ethereal being was encased in the protective home of her mother, the nature that hid her. "Don't be afraid. I'm your friend, and Peter Pan is here. Are you with your family? What are their names? Willow, maybe, or Sage?" The temperature dropped gradually, unnoticed, as Jody hummed and dug. The morning slid into afternoon as she crawled on her knees around the perimeter of the fence, searching. The sun began to slide down toward a peaceful sleep, and a thin veneer of sanity patched together her wanton reality. Chapter 23. Blink. Tony entered her house with a sigh of relief. She closed the door from the cold, threw her coat over the end of the couch, and stood for a moment just to enjoy the quiet. She had returned from a week-long advocate training session in St. Paul. It was an annual class she had to attend to keep her training up to date, but they were always exhausting. She had had to put work on hold and hadn't talked to family or friends in over a week. She needed her daily can of Dr. Pepper. The sound of the pressure pop from opening a can of soda always gave her an excited anticipation, not unlike an alcoholic anticipating that first taste of vodka before the bottle is opened. She figured if she had to have an addiction, soda wasn't the worst one she could have. She stood at the kitchen counter, enjoying the drink and peering out the window to her backyard, not really looking at anything in particular. She lifted the can to her lips and eyed the muted colors of winter out her back window, glad the week was over. Her mind was busy trying to decipher the myriad of information she'd consumed from the training, while her body campaigned for a soft bed by sending fatigue warnings to her neck and back. She lowered the can from her lips and sighed from pleasure as she shifted her weight to lean her hip against the kitchen sink. The slight shift in position had her notice a movement of purple from across the fence next door. It took her eyes a moment to send the message to her brain of what she saw. She placed the can on the counter and leaned closer to the window for a better look. Next door, in the Warrens' backyard, she saw Jody crawling on her hands and knees in the dirt, appearing to be searching for something. Tony's brows came together in a deep furrow of concern. She watched Jody for several minutes before noticing her hands and knees of her pants were caked in mud, and her arms appeared to have first-degree frostbite from being coatless in the low 20s weather. "Jody, what are you doing?" she asked into the air. She watched for a few more seconds before saying aloud to the empty room, "And is she talking to herself?" She didn't notice her own irony. Pushing herself away from the window, she grabbed a sweater hanging by the back door and walked out to investigate her neighbor's strange behavior, ignoring her body's tired complaining. She let herself in the gate of Jody's yard and stood watching her friend continue to crawl around the ground. "Jody," she said hesitantly, holding onto the gate as if needing an escape route. Not getting an answer, she carefully walked a little further into the yard. "Jody, honey, what are you doing?" Tony watched as Jody continued to search and dig with her hands, ignoring her questions. She finally walked over to where Jody had stopped, seemingly interested in a particular spot in the dead garden. Looking down at the top of Jody's head, not able to see her face, she listened in surprised worry as Jody talked quietly to herself. Tony reached down and placed her hand on the top of Jody's head. "Jody, are you okay?" Jody looked up with a slow cock of her head, looking at Tony like a child holding on to a secret. "Hello," she simply said, a small smile barely curving the corners of her mouth. Her eyes had a faraway look in them, seeing something Tony couldn't see. Tony realized something was wrong, and it put her system into instant alert mode. Hi," Tony said uneasily, squatting next to her friend. "What are you doing?" "Shh," Jody said, putting a dirty finger to her mouth. "You'll scare them." "Sorry," Tony said automatically. She watched as Jody brushed frost from the dormant root of a dug-up tulip bulb. Taking a chance, she said, who am I going to scare?" Tony sat back on her haunches and waited patiently for Jody to answer. When she knew no answer was coming, she asked again, "Jody, who am I going to scare?" "I have to get the snow off their home so when they wake up, they'll have a pretty place to live. It's almost spring, you know." Tony was becoming more scared with each passing second. Something was terribly wrong with her friend. The hair on her arms raised in goosebumps of fear. "Whose home, honey?" "The fairies, of course. They're sleeping for winter, but come spring they'll be up and flying and will want to have a beautiful garden to live in." Okay. What makes you think there are fairies in your garden?" Tony asked, trying to not sound alarmed. "There are fairies everywhere, silly. But right now I'm looking for Tinker Bell. I found Peter Pan in the house alone, and I know Dougie J always puts her outside so she can be with her friends. I think she got disoriented and got lost. Fairies sleep in the middle of leaves and flowers to stay warm in the winter, and I'm trying to find her so she can be with them again." Not knowing what to do, Tony reached over and slightly touched Jody's shoulder. Can I help you find her?" Jody pulled the bulb away and said with an indrawn breath of air, "Oh, no, you don't know what to do. You have to be very careful or you can hurt them." Okay, Tony reassured her hurriedly, pulling back her hand. "I won't touch them, I swear. I'll let you do it, okay?" "Okay," Jody went back to cleaning the brown tuber. "Jody," Tony began, "if I let you keep the flowers, will you come inside? You're freezing." Jody ignored Tony's question as she worked diligently on the mud around the bulb. Tony, her fear turning to worry that something medical might be wrong with her friend, crawled in front of Jody and sat back on her heels. Carefully raising her hands to Jody's face like she were confronting a skittish colt, she gently placed them on Jody's cheeks and raised her face until their eyes met. "Jody, honey, why don't you come inside?" Jody's answer had Tony grow rigid with worry. "Why do you keep calling me Jody?" she asked, the confusion clear in her eyes. "What?" Worry escalated to a higher level of fear. "Why do you keep calling me Jody?" she repeated. "My name's not Jody." "Oh, okay. What do you want me to call you?" "You can call me by my fairy name. Every fairy has a name that reflects their personality. Didn't you know that?" No, I didn't know that. I'm sorry." Tony spoke softly, afraid any loud noise would frighten Jody away. Carefully she asked, "So what is your fairy name?" "Silly, you know what it is." "I'm sorry," Tony said carefully. "I guess I forgot. Can you tell me again?" Without looking up, Jody answered matter-of-factly, "Blink. My name is Blink." Later, confronting Doug. "Doug, it took everything I had to get her back inside the house. She was freezing and didn't even seem to feel it. Tony had stayed with Jody until Doug had gotten home. She needs to go to the hospital." "Where is she now?" he wanted to know. "She's in the bedroom with Audra. She got home from school just as I was able to clean Jody up and get her in bed. Her clothes were covered in mud and her hands were actually bleeding from digging around in the dirt. I don't understand. You said she was looking for a Tinkerbell doll? Yes, I guess it used to be Dougie J's. But Doug, she wasn't looking for a doll. She actually thinks Tinkerbell is alive and that there are other fairies living outside. That's ridiculous. You must have misunderstood her. I'm sure she was simply getting started early on some gardening and found the doll outside. You must have thought she said she was looking for a fairy. Tony was getting angry at Doug's condescending attitude, and she didn't try to hide it when she replied in an equally condescending tone. I did not misunderstand her, and I resent you saying so, and I certainly am not imagining her cut and frozen hands. Why would she start planting flowers in 20 degrees weather anyway? Tell me what that's about. I'm not trying to insult you, Tony. It's just Jody has been under a lot of stress, and I think you might be reading more into this than there really is. Really? Tony said sarcastically. Well, I certainly didn't imagine it when she told me her fairy name is Blink. Well, no, maybe not. I don't know what that's about. She needs a hospital, Doug, Tony said a little more calmly. No, she doesn't. I'm not taking to her hospital where they'll try and convince me she needs a psychiatrist or something. I will not have people talking about us like that. What? Tony was truly confused. You won't have people talking. Doug, this isn't about what people might say. It's about Jody's mental well-being. I know that, and that's not what I meant. Listen, I'm just a little beside myself right now, but I'll take care of it. I don't want you to worry about it, okay? Doug, I'm used to dealing with people who are grieving, but this is beyond anything I've ever seen. This is beyond grieving. It's like Jody has disassociated herself from reality. No, you listen, he insisted. I'm sure it's not as bad as you're making it sound. She probably just missed a dose of her medicine. I'll ask Audra to check into it since she's been keeping track. In truth, I think because of your job, you see trouble where there isn't any. Really? Well, you think whatever you want, but at least let me help you with her. I'm truly worried. I know you are, but like I said, I'll take care of it. Her, he corrected. Now, I hate to be rude, but I appreciate you finding her, but I have to ask you to go so I can take care of her. Tony was dumbstruck by Doug's dismissing her like she was a bothersome servant. Turning abruptly on her heel, she jerked her coat off the back of the chair and headed for the front door. Fine, she said, not trying to hide her anger. But I will be checking in on her tomorrow. That will be fine, and I appreciate you looking in on her when I'm at work. But I assure you that by tomorrow she'll be of her old self again. Tony reached for the door handle and stopped. Turning around to see Doug, she said, "Oh, and by the way, you can tell Blink," she made quotation marks in the air. "I found Tinkerbell. She was under the tree in the middle of the yard under some leaves. I kicked her up after I went back outside to get the Peter Pan doll she left. I put them both on the kitchen table, if she asks." Tony walked out of the house without waiting for a response from Doug. She had known the Warrens for years, but it was the first time she had ever seen a side of Doug she didn't like. She always considered him a people person because he had the ability to make whoever he was talking to feel like they were the only person in the room. But this Doug seemed more concerned with himself than his wife, more worried about what other people might say, more callous and self-absorbed. End of that one, and then we will head on to section 6.